On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book and the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual celebration of Black History Month. Speaking today is Dr. Wendy A. Gaudin, author of Sunset Limited, an autobiography of Creole. Wendy A. Gaudin is a historian and writer whose interdisciplinary work centers Southern descended mixed heritage and mixed-race populations and histories. As a mixed-heritage Louisiana Creole of color whose elders migrated to California in the first half of the 20th century, Gaudin is deeply moved, shaped, and inspired by her expansive community story. She divides her time between New Orleans and Acadiana, and she teaches history at Xavier University of Louisiana. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wendy A. Gaudin.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak for Black History Month, and thank you for the invitation from the Louisiana Center for the Book. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the work that I do, and that is Creole history, and particularly the histories of Creoles of color who left Louisiana and migrated to California during the period that we refer to as the Jim Crow era, or the period of Jim Crow segregation in the Deep South. My family originated in four distinct areas. My four grandparents. One of them was from the town of Vacherie, which is in St. James Parish, Louisiana. And another grandparent was from Darrow, Louisiana, which is in Ascension Parish. And Vacherie and Darrow are not far from each other, but they are culturally distinct from each other. My other two grandparents are from the city of New Orleans. One is from the 7th Ward in the downtown area of New Orleans, and the other was from the uptown neighborhood of New Orleans. And so even though they were both from the same city, those two areas of the city were quite distinct in their cultural practices. And so when I research my family's history, I learned that my grandparents came from Francophone, a Francophone heritage, a Francophone history. They also were part of the African diaspora, and which can also be classified as Francophone in some ways for some populations. And they were also descendants of indigenous populations in the Deep South, and especially on my grandfather's side, whom I'm going to speak about today, the Mississippi Choctaw Band is a descendant in our family's history on the Gaudin side. And so my work looks at the ways in which living Creoles of color engage with ancestry and engage with family history. And I also look at the ways in which California Creoles, again, engage with those populations in Louisiana, those who did not migrate to California, and those who may not have had the resources to migrate, or those who chose not to migrate. Sometimes these narratives focus on privilege or resources, ability, but it's so important to acknowledge that some Creoles of color in Louisiana chose to stay here in the Deep South, even though they were combating racism and combating segregation. They made the decision to stay in the place where Creole actually meant something. When my family settled in Los Angeles, Creole was a foreign term. Creole did not have any kind of place identification. It was a different terminology. And over the generations, as more and more families moved west, Creole became a part of a migrant population that settled in Southern California. So today, what I would like to do is I would like to read two portions of a chapter in my book, and I would like to talk a little bit about my grandfather's history. His name was John Nora Gaudin, and I would actually like to share some images as well. So before sharing images, I will begin reading from my book. And the chapter that is about my paternal grandfather is called Holy Name. So this is one part of that chapter. I'd heard from my paternal grandfather, John Nora Gaudin, that his father lived for more than 100 years, and that he died admiring the fruit in the orchard on his little piece of land that faced the Mississippi River out in Ascension Parish. I'd heard that the Cajuns nearby walked across his farm, uninvited, to test the land for oil. Eh, Nonk, they called him, their work boots trampling the grass. Nonk, the Cajun word for uncle, carried with it the onus of racism. It was unfathomable to call a man of his color, a brown-skinned Afro-Creole man, Mr. Gaudin. The second time they came, my grandfather's father met them with a shotgun and some blunt words in their own language, and they never called him Nonk again. My grandfather said this about his father. He was nice and calm. He was a man, you know what I mean. But don't walk over him. The minute you thought you was going to step on him, you were stepping on a rattlesnake, and he would let you know it in a minute. I'd heard from my paternal grandfather that he grew up knowing that some of those Cajun men in Bayou Manchac and Crowley Ditch and Welsh Gully were kin to him and his father's people, but he also knew to keep that information to himself. The Cajun men had no visible admixture, no obvious trace of African ancestry, only the occasional rumor, although they were outlandish. They were thick-tongued and sunburned, they of squirrel tail and nutria pelt, of raccoon musk and oyster breath. There was little advantage to being ethnically Cajun in those days, when they were sometimes referred to as rednecks. Yes, they spoke a variety of Louisiana French and a variety of Louisiana English too. They practiced Roman Catholicism. They lived mostly rural lives of hunting, fishing, shucking, and skinning. Their skin sometimes a darker brown than that of Afro-Creoles. Their culture practically identical to the one that defined the Gaudins' lives. But the Cajuns were hybrid whites. They were ethnic whites. Benefiting from their marginal whiteness, they were defenders of whiteness still. And they called my great-grandfather Nonk. My granddaddy was a Union soldier, Grandpa once told me, pride in his voice, a serious sharpness in his gray eyes. Sometimes my grandfather became animated when he spoke. His tenor turned baritone at an elevated volume, whispers of that rattlesnake he inherited from his father. My granddaddy hated that segregation, and I hated it too, he said. One of the themes that often arose in our conversations especially after I became a history major in college, was racial segregation in the Catholic Church. Grandpa detested it. An infrequently angry man, it angered him. He thought it was a betrayal, a cruel hypocrisy. How could a religious institution uphold an evil, unbiblical law? Decades after desegregation, the subject still turned Grandpa's face red. A repeated refrain, "I could never understand that, and I never will," he said. "The house of God, and black people had to sit in the back. It wasn't right." A lifelong devout Catholic and a man completely committed to his wife and children, Grandpa served the Catholic Church in all the ways that he could. In 1979, when I was 9 years old, he retired from his work as a carpenter, entered the seminary, and came out a deacon, the closest he could get to the priesthood. To his ordination, my cousins and I wore our best Gaudin sewn dresses. My cousin Edris, the only boy, wore a suit that Grandma made. We grandchildren even sang with the church choir. After Mass, my paternal grandfather came down from the altar in his clerical robe, his joy saved for later, his face utterly serene. So that is an introduction to my grandfather, who was our great elder in the Gaudin family and who served as a deacon in Holy Name of Jesus Church in Los Angeles for well over 25 years. And it's one of the reasons why I named my chapter Holy Name, because my grandfather was so associated with that parish, but also he was so devout as a Roman Catholic. Holy Name of Jesus was actually a site of the California Creole migrant population. And when I was growing up, we would occasionally go to Mass at my grandparents' church. And we would see people who knew our grandparents from New Orleans. They would pat them on the back, speak to them in some of the Louisiana colloquialisms that my sisters and I listened to, but didn't always understand. And even after church, in the church hall, we would eat Creole food that my grandfather and other people in the church prepared every Sunday. So I would like to share some images just to share some of my family history with you. This first image is my grandfather, John Nora Gaudin, who was born in Darrow, Louisiana, in Ascension Parish. And this is an image of him before he moved to Los Angeles. While he was living in Louisiana, he was a carpenter. And throughout his life, he honed his skill and eventually became a master carpenter. Well, while he was living in Louisiana, he was a member of the quote unquote Colored Carpenters Union because during this period, most unions were racially segregated. And so, one of the things that I discuss in the chapter Holy Name is that my grandfather was very proud to belong to the colored, quote unquote, Colored Carpenters Union, but he shared with me and he shared with our family that the carpenters of color oftentimes were paid less than white carpenters. Perhaps they were given the worst jobs, and they weren't always treated in a dignified way, even though Creoles of color were very well known for their carpentry skills. And so During World War II, my grandfather worked for the US military building bomb shelters and bunkers. And he was sent to actually the state of Washington, where he worked on a bomb shelter. And he noticed that Black men, Asian men, brown men, white men, immigrant men, men who spoke English, men who spoke very little English, they all traveled, worked together, they ate together, they slept in similar and community shelters. And he was so moved by that lack of racial oppression and racial segregation that at the end of his service, he returned to Louisiana and he told my grandmother, "It's time for us to get out of here. We are going to move west." And so in 1945, my two grandparents moved to Los Angeles with their two young children. And this is my grandmother. Her name was Rita Rue, and she is the grandmother who was raised on North Miro Street in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. In Sunset Limited, I also delve into the Rue family history and I delve into the culture of the 7th Ward and some of the complexities of urban Creole culture versus the rural culture that my grandfather came from. One of the reasons why my grandfather moved to New Orleans from Darrow was because there was no high school for Black children, for Creoles of color, for non-white children in Darrow or in Donaldsonville, which is very close to Darrow, just across the Mississippi River. So his older brother, my great uncle Earl, was living in New Orleans, and he had graduated from Xavier University. He is right there in the middle with his head kind of cocked a little bit to the side, my Uncle Earl Gaudin. So my grandfather came to New Orleans and moved in with his brother while he finished high school at John McDonough High School. That is my father, Anthony Gaudin, who was the only son of John and Rita Gaudin. This is an image that we cherish in our family. It is an image of my father in a Philip Morris costume, and he is dressed for Mardi Gras. I should note that the image was taken by, the photograph was taken by the photographer Florestine Perrault Collins. This is another image of my father that was taken before he moved with his family to Los Angeles. This image was taken, this photograph was taken by Arthur Baidu, another prominent photographer in New Orleans, and it was taken at Xavier University of Louisiana. This was a piano recital given by children in the community who were taking piano lessons with the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament at Xavier. And my father is this child at the center of the image on the left with his hand on the keyboard, wearing a white suit. And he even remembers some of the names of the piano teachers who taught him when he was just a small child. This is an image of my father and his two sisters, my Aunt Sandy in the middle and my Aunt Rosie on the right. And this is the elder grandmother Rue, who was also from the 7th Ward of New Orleans. and she watched all of her children migrate to Los Angeles. One of the reasons why families moved to Los Angeles was because they wanted their children to have the opportunities that were unavailable to them in the segregated South. My grandfather and my grandmother had a dream that their son would become a dentist. They told my father, "We would love to have a dentist in the family. That would be such a great distinction." And my father famously told them, "I don't want to stare into people's mouths my whole life. That's not the profession that is for me." So he went to college at University of Southern California, and he studied biology. And that was at first a disappointment to my grandparents because biologists study evolution and they study science. And in many ways, they challenge the teachings of the Catholic Church. And my father did indeed challenge his parents' beliefs and his own upbringing as a Catholic. And he did become a biology professor. I wrote a chapter about him in my book called Taxonomy, which looks at how biologists categorize all kinds of things in the natural world. But the question is race part of the natural world? And the answer to that is no. So my father raised my sisters and I in a way that allowed us to develop our own sense of self, our own sense of identity, our own racial affinity, all within the lens of a scientific fatherhood. So my father getting his PhD from USC and becoming a biology professor was one of the dreams that westward migrant Creoles of color had. They wanted their children to go to college, whether that was at an HBCU or at a majority serving institution like USC. They didn't want their children to be limited, but also they wanted them to have other kinds of opportunities, including political ones. In California, my father met my mother, who was also a Creole of color. Her name is Eleanor Burns. And her parents are on the right in this photograph, this wedding photograph from 1958. Here is my grandmother, Marietta Roussel, who was from Vacherie, Louisiana, and my maternal grandfather, Augustus Lawrence Burns, who went by Lawrence August, but his name was Augustus Lawrence Burns. And I write about both of them in my book as well, because both of them had a different kind of experience. My grandmother, Marietta Roussel, came from sugarcane country, and she experienced what many Creoles of color experience. That is the challenging upbringing of a mother without a father. And so some of the work that I do in this book is about fatherhood and motherhood and what that looks like for Creoles of color, particularly those who have white fathers or grandfathers. And then Augustus Lawrence Burns was a Pullman porter on the Sunset Limited train to California. It is where I got the title for the book. My mother and I were talking about how my grandfather's job working on the Sunset Limited train opened the door for my family's migration. And so the Sunset Limited also represents this vein of escape for many Creoles of color from Louisiana to California. And so in many oral histories that were shared with me and many oral histories that are shared elsewhere, we hear the name Sunset Limited pop up again and again. It is a kind of mythical history, but it is also a very real avenue of employment, of dignified employment, albeit on a racially segregated train. So it is one of the ironies of history for Creoles of color that this train represented change and migration and movement west. It represented hope and opportunity, but it was a segregated train. In this wedding picture, my mother is in the middle, and my father is to her left, and then Rita Rue and John Nora Gaudin is on the far left. Like many Creoles of color, my grandfather, as a master carpenter, built his own house. And he was helped by my two great uncles, John and Albert, who were my grandmother's brothers. They settled in an area that's now called Jefferson Park in Los Angeles, where hundreds of families from Louisiana also migrated. Many of them share this history of settling in Los Angeles, purchasing a piece of land, and then building their own homes. And so my grandfather did this. So did my godfather, his family, the Aubreys. They also built their homes. And many other families in this particular area of West Los Angeles echo the same history. That is my grandfather on the right in his work clothes. That is my mother in the middle. And that is my father's sister, Rosella, on the left. And you can see the image was taken in 1957. This neighborhood is where Holy Name of Jesus was located and is still located. And it was so very saturated with Creoles from Louisiana who wanted to continue their culture. So they ate Creole foods. They drank coffee and chicory. They ate French bread and beignets. They got their hair cut at the Louisiana barber shop. They also ate boudin and andouille. And they worshiped at a Catholic church that was largely populated by people like themselves who came in a broad range of phenotype and who represented also a broad range of culture depending on where in Louisiana they came from. This is an image of my family, a photograph of my family when I was very young. I am the child that my father is holding up in the back. And that's my dad with his 1970s sideburns and my mother on the left. And those are my sisters in the middle. My sister Leslie is the oldest, and my sister Roslyn is on the right. Another thing that I write about in Sunset Limited is this kind of secondary migration that occurred for many Creoles of color. And that is that our families left Louisiana and migrated to California. And for my family, my extended family, we migrated to Los Angeles. Well, when my father got his PhD and became a biology professor, he moved the family out to the Los Angeles suburbs. So I grew up in the Northridge, Porter Ranch region of Los Angeles. And at the time when our family moved there, the freeway didn't even go that far. So they moved beyond the edge of the freeway. And it felt so very far away from the center of the Creole community in West Los Angeles. When our parents moved out to the suburbs, my sisters and I experienced another degree of separation from our Creole heritage. So we were raised in a suburb that was largely of Ashkenazi Jewish culture and population. So our best friends were Jewish girls. And so we grew up going to Mass, but then also sometimes going to synagogue with our friends or attending Seder with our friends or going to our friends' bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs. So we had this very interesting kind of separation from our Creole heritage, but also an expansion of our sense of self and how we relate to people who are different from us. Our cousins, however, stayed in West Los Angeles. So, one of the interesting aspects of our history and many other families like ours was that our sense of being Creole was a little bit ajar compared to our first cousins, whose families stayed close to those Creole connections. And so that secondary migration helps explain why I returned to Louisiana to try to understand what does it mean to be Creole? Who am I as a Creole of color? How do I define my sense of Blackness? All of those questions were up in the air for me for a very long time, and I chose to reverse migrate to Los Angeles to learn some of the answers to those questions. This is an image of my grandfather's ordination when he became a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. And my grandfather is here in his robe with his mustache that he used to wax and twirl at the ends. And when I was very young, his mustache actually curled. And as a child, I loved to look at his curled, twisted mustache. It was such a unique feature of my grandfather's face. Next to him is my grandmother, Rita Rue. And in the dark glasses, that is my mother. And my cousin is here. My sister is here. Another cousin, my sister. And then there is me at the end in a dress that my grandmother sewed for me. My grandmother sewed many of our clothes. She also sewed the panels that hung at Holy Name Catholic Church. And she also sewed some of the vestments that the priests wore in the church. So I would like to end my talk with a very brief piece from the end of the chapter, Holy Name, which is about my beloved grandfather. I'd heard from Grandpa that there was no school for children of color where his family's farm once stood. No school for the racially ambiguous children who were so plentiful in the plantation lands of Ascension Parish. And so each weekday morning, a flatboat carried my grandfather and his siblings across the river to St. Augustine's School in the town of Donaldsonville. Founded in 1886 by the Sisters of the Holy Family, St. Augustine's gave my grandfather his formal education in English, as Creole increasingly became the at-home tongue. When my grandfather attended St. Augustine's school, he was told that his relative, Mother Juliette Gaudin, had been one of the founders of the Catholic religious order, the Sisters of the Holy Family, in New Orleans in 1842. Juliette, a free woman of color, is often referred to as Cuban because she was born in Cuba to parents who had been born in Haiti. What are the connections between Juliette Gaudin and my grandfather, John Nora Gaudin? Was there any connection beyond the surname? She was a nun, after all, so there is no proof that she was one of our ancestors. Beyond belonging to the population of free people of color in Louisiana, was she related to my family? Mother Juliette died in 1888. Did she have a nephew who moved upriver, who had sons, and those sons had sons who grew up in Ascension Parish? Gaudin is an uncommon French name in Louisiana, a small family group. There are many layers of possibility. The difficult morality of paternal heritage leaves many questions unanswered. Grandpa graduated from St. Augustine's in 1926. Since there were no public schools for children of color where he grew up, it follows that there was no high school either. So he migrated to New Orleans and graduated from John McDonough Colored High School in 1930. In 1932, while visiting New Orleans, he attended a carnival ball. On that night, my grandfather met the woman who would become my paternal grandmother, Rita Elizabeth Rue. The ball was held at the Autocrat Club, which was aptly named. The members were known to have been autocratic about who was allowed in. My grandmother arrived chaperoned and proper in a gown and feathered mask. They met, they danced. When Lent began, my grandfather returned home to Ascension Parish, but he wrote her letters, including a photograph in one. He is brown and striking. His ancestry is clear in the sharp line of his nose and in the set of his mouth. A foot resting on a bent knee. In the photo, he is relaxed, sitting reclined against a backdrop of his father's corn and cotton fields. Someone wrote his name, John Gaudin, on the photo. He isn't what my grandmother's family wanted for her, a man from the city, but he is the one my grandmother wanted for herself. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.